I never imagined that at 58 years old, I'd find myself standing in the lavish ballroom bathroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel, mascara streaking down my face, clutching the beaded evening bag that contained a check for $47,000. But there I was, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror, the sounds of my son Christopher's wedding reception muffled by the thick wooden door. Just 3 hours earlier, I'd been filled with nothing but pride and joy as I watched my only child marry the woman he loved. Now I was contemplating an announcement that would change our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bathroom door opened, and I quickly dabbed at my eyes. A teenage girl, probably one of the bride's cousins, gave me a curious look before disappearing into a stall. I straightened my navy blue dress, the one that had been dismissed as something from the clearance rack at JCPenney, by my new daughter-in-law, Vanessa, loud enough for half the bridal party to hear. The dress I'd spent weeks searching for, wanting to look elegant but not overshadow the bride. The dress that had prompted the final straw in a 2-year buildup of slights, dismissals, and barely concealed contempt. I took a deep breath and smoothed my silver-streaked hair. No more hiding in bathrooms. It was time to reclaim my dignity, even if it meant revealing a secret I'd kept for the sake of my son's happiness. That every crystal champagne flute, every orchid centerpiece, every bite of the 5-tier wedding cake had been paid for by me. Before we continue with what happened when I walked back into that reception, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against someone who underestimated you, give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special just for you. Now, let's get back to how my son's dream wedding became my awakening. I'd always had a complicated relationship with my son Christopher. As a single mother who'd raised him after his father walked out when he was just 3, I'd devoted everything to ensuring he had every opportunity I never had. I worked 2 jobs through most of his childhood, my day position as an administrative assistant at Westlake Medical Center, and evenings managing a small bookstore downtown. Every extra dollar went toward his education, his sports equipment, his future. The sacrifice had paid off. Christopher graduated with honors from State University, landed a job at a prestigious financial firm, and at 30 had a promising career ahead of him. I couldn't have been prouder. Then he met Vanessa during a charity gala his firm was sponsoring. Vanessa came from what she called old money, though I would later discover that her family's fortune had dwindled significantly over the past decade. She was beautiful, polished, and educated at exclusive private schools, everything I was not. From our first meeting, she regarded me with barely disguised judgment, taking in my practical clothing and simple jewelry with eyes that calculated their worth and found it wanting. "Christopher has told me how hard you worked as a single mom," she'd said during that first dinner, her voice dripping with a condescension masked as compliment. It must be so satisfying to see him finally moving in more elevated circles. I'd smiled and nodded, determined to be supportive of my son's obvious infatuation. If Vanessa made Christopher happy, I would find a way to connect with her. After all, I reminded myself, she was young, just 27, and perhaps her privileged upbringing had simply left her without the awareness of how her words might sound to others. When Christopher called me a year later, excitement bubbling in his voice, to tell me he'd proposed and Vanessa had said yes, I felt a mixture of happiness for him and apprehension about what lay ahead. That apprehension proved warranted the very next day when they came to my modest 2-bedroom townhouse to show me the ring and discuss wedding plans. "We're thinking of the Grand Meridian," Vanessa announced, referencing the city's most exclusive hotel. "June wedding, around 200 guests. I've already spoken with Mother's event planner." I nearly choked on my tea. The Grand Meridian was far beyond what Christopher could afford on his salary, even with his recent promotion. Before I could voice concerns about costs, Vanessa continued with a dismissive wave. Of course, we understand if you can only contribute a token amount to the wedding, Barbara. Christopher's told me how you're still paying off your mortgage. My parents will handle the important elements. The assumption stung, but not as much as the flash of embarrassment that crossed my son's face. In that moment, I made a decision that would ultimately lead to the confrontation in the hotel bathroom 2 years later. Actually, I said carefully, I'd like to help as much as I can. Christopher is my only child, after all. What I didn't tell them was that 5 years earlier, my Aunt Margaret had left me a substantial inheritance. Not a fortune by Vanessa's standards, certainly, but enough that, combined with my diligent saving habits, meant I had far more financial security than my lifestyle suggested. I'd always lived modestly, partly from years of necessity, and partly because extravagance simply wasn't in my nature. "That's sweet, Barbara," Vanessa replied with a tight smile. "But weddings at the Meridian typically run well into 6 figures. Perhaps you could handle something small, like the rehearsal dinner at that little Italian place you like." "Vanessa," Christopher interjected, looking uncomfortable. "Mom can contribute whatever she's comfortable with." But I had already made up my mind. "Let me worry about what I can afford," I said with more confidence than I felt. "This is your special day, and I want it to be everything you've dreamed of." Over the next few weeks, it became clear that Vanessa's parents weren't quite as financially prepared to fund an extravagant wedding as she had implied. Her father, Richard, called me directly one evening, his voice tight with controlled frustration. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Barbara, I'll be straight with you. Our investments took a significant hit in the last recession, and while we're still comfortable, Vanessa's wedding expectations are ambitious. Patricia and I can contribute $30,000, which is generous by any standard, but according to the wedding planner's preliminary budget, we're looking at closer to $80,000 total. I sat in stunned silence, the figure echoing in my mind. $80,000 for a single day. The practical part of me, the part that had stretched every dollar during Christopher's childhood, recoiled at the extravagance. But another part, the part that had always wanted to give my son everything, saw an opportunity. "I understand, Richard," I said finally. "Let me see what I can do." The next day, I met with my financial advisor and withdrew $50,000 from my inheritance fund. It would mean postponing the kitchen renovation I'd been planning and the trip to Europe I'd dreamed about for years, but seeing Christopher happy on his wedding day would be worth it. When I called Richard to tell him I could cover the remaining balance, he was quiet for a moment. "That's unexpectedly generous, Barbara," he said, curiosity evident in his voice. "Vanessa had given us the impression that your financial situation was rather limited." "I've always been careful with money," I replied simply, "and I've saved for Christopher's future since the day he was born." Richard seemed to appreciate my discretion. "I won't mention the specifics to Vanessa or Christopher unless you want me to. Sometimes it's easier when they assume we parents are handling everything." I agreed, partly because I didn't want Christopher to feel indebted to me, and partly because I suspected Vanessa might reject my contribution if she knew the true extent of it. What I didn't anticipate was how this arrangement would lead to months of planning during which I was simultaneously essential, as the secret financier, and invisible, as the groom's supposedly financially strapped mother. The wedding planning proceeded at a whirlwind pace, with Vanessa firmly in control of every decision. I was included in obligatory events, cake tastings, venue tours, floral arrangements, but my opinions were solicited and then summarily dismissed. I watched as Vanessa selected the most expensive option at every turn, secure in her belief that her parents were covering the majority of costs. "The premium orchid package is only $3,000 more," she would say, waving away concerns from the wedding planner about the budget. "Daddy won't mind." Each time I would exchange glances with Richard, who would give a resigned nod. Another few thousand added to my growing contribution. 6 months before the wedding, during a bridal luncheon hosted by Patricia, Vanessa's mother, I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. I had stepped out to the garden for a moment of peace amid the champagne-fueled chatter when Vanessa's voice floated through the open French doors. "Christopher's mother is sweet, but so provincial," she was saying to someone. "I'm actually having the wedding planner give her a separate list of suggested outfits for the wedding. Nothing too fashion-forward or expensive, obviously. We can't have her showing up looking like she wandered in from a bus tour." Laughter followed, including a voice I recognized as Patricia's. "You're handling it beautifully, darling. These situations require delicacy. Not everyone can be expected to understand the standards of an event like this." I stood frozen, the carefully cultivated hydrangeas blurring as tears pricked at my eyes. Provincial. A word that dismissed my entire existence as quaint and unsophisticated. A judgment on not just my clothing or my home, but on who I was. For a moment, I considered walking in and revealing exactly who was paying for half of those precious standards, but the thought of embarrassing Christopher held me back. Instead, I quietly returned to my car, begging off the remainder of the luncheon with a text claiming a sudden migraine. That night, alone in my townhouse, I pulled out photo albums from Christopher's childhood, images of birthday parties. In our small apartment, his first baseball uniform that I'd paid for by picking up extra shifts, the camping trips we took because they were vacations I could afford. In every photo, his smile was genuine, his happiness unconnected to how much anything cost. When had that changed? When had my son begun to see me through Vanessa's eyes, as someone slightly embarrassing, someone to be managed rather than celebrated? I closed the albums and made myself a cup of tea, sitting at my kitchen table and truly looking at my surroundings for the first time in years. My home wasn't lavish, but it was comfortable, filled with books and mementos from a life well lived. The furniture was quality, chosen for durability rather than fashion. The art on my walls was selected because each piece spoke to me, not because it impressed others. I had built this life through hard work and careful choices, and somewhere along the way, I had allowed Vanessa, and perhaps Christopher too, to make me feel ashamed of it. The next morning, I called my longtime friend Diana, who had watched me raise Christopher while she built a successful career as a personal stylist. "I need your help," I told her. "I want to look elegant for Christopher's wedding, but still like myself. And," I added with newfound determination, "I'm willing to invest in something special." Diana's delight was palpable. "Finally, I've been waiting years for this call. I know exactly where to start." Over the next month, Diana guided me through a transformation that wasn't about erasing who I was, but about presenting the best version of myself. We selected a navy blue gown that complemented my figure, subtle but quality jewelry, and she even convinced me to update my hairstyle, incorporating the silver strands I'd previously considered coloring. "Own your journey," she advised as we stood in a boutique dressing room. "You've earned every silver hair, every laugh line. The right clothes just frame the masterpiece." When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a woman trying to compete with her wealthy in-laws. I saw myself, Barbara Collins, mother, professional, survivor, standing tall in a dress that made me feel confident rather than costumed. I kept my new look a secret, wanting it to be a surprise for the wedding day. As the date approached, my financial contribution continued to grow as Vanessa added last-minute upgrades, premium liquor for the open bar, a string quartet for the ceremony, welcome bags for out-of-town guests filled with local gourmet items. The final tally came to just over $92,000, of which I was covering $62,000, far more than I had initially planned. Richard called me, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating costs. "Barbara, this has gone beyond what either of us anticipated. Are you certain you can manage this?" "I've made my decision," I said firmly. But I would appreciate it if, after the wedding, we could be honest with our children about who contributed what. I don't need immediate recognition, but I don't want to perpetuate this misconception indefinitely. Of course, Richard agreed, sounding relieved. After the honeymoon, we'll sit down with them together. The week of the wedding arrived with a flurry of activities. The rehearsal dinner, which I hosted at an upscale restaurant rather than that little Italian place, the bridesmaids' luncheon, the final venue walkthrough. Through it all, I maintained a quiet dignity, even as Vanessa continued to treat me with benevolent condescension. But preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, please subscribe to our channel. It means so much. Now, let's get back to what happened on the wedding day itself. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, as if even the weather was adhering to Vanessa's exacting standards. I arrived early at the Grand Meridian, settling into a small suite I'd reserved for myself to prepare for the day. Diana came to help with my hair and makeup, transforming me with her expert touch. "You look stunning," she declared as I stood in my navy gown, a delicate silver necklace at my throat, my hair swept into an elegant updo that framed my face. "I feel like myself," I replied, surprised at the confidence in my voice. "Just enhanced." Diana squeezed my hand. "Exactly as it should be." I made my way to the bridal suite to say good morning to Christopher, and was met with a moment of genuine surprise as he turned from adjusting his cufflinks. "Mom," he breathed, his eyes widening. "You look incredible." For an instant, I saw recognition in his eyes, not just of how I looked, but of who I was, of the strength that had carried us both through years of challenges. Then Vanessa's voice called from the adjoining room, and the moment passed. "Your mother's here. Remind her that the photographer wants family shots at 2, not before." Christopher's expression shifted, a flash of something, embarrassment, regret, crossing his features before he composed himself. "You heard the boss," he said with a forced lightness, attempting humor to cover the awkwardness. "I heard," I replied, keeping my smile in place. "I'll see you at 2. The ceremony was beautiful, even I had to admit. The Grand Meridian's garden terrace had been transformed with white roses and crystal decorations that caught the afternoon sunlight. As I watched Christopher and Vanessa exchange vows, my complicated feelings dissolved momentarily into simple happiness for my son. Whatever my issues with Vanessa, he had chosen her, and I would respect that choice. It was during the cocktail hour that the first incident occurred. I was speaking with Christopher's godfather, Michael, when Vanessa approached with her cousin, Stephanie, the socialite of the family, known for her fashion blog and cutting opinions. "Barbara, there you are," Vanessa said, air-kissing my cheek. "Stephanie was just admiring your dress. It's so appropriate for a woman of your age." Stephanie tilted her head, examining me with the critical eye of someone used to assigning value based on labels. "It's quite nice, actually. Let me guess. Nordstrom's sale rack? You have a good eye for bargains." Before I could respond, Vanessa laughed lightly. "Barbara's always been practical. Christopher says she kept the same sofa for 15 years because it was perfectly good. Isn't that charming?" The word landed like a slap. Charming. As if my financial prudence was a quaint character quirk rather than the discipline that had allowed me to put my son through college without debt and pay for half of this very wedding. "Actually, I began, then stopped myself. This wasn't the time or place. "Thank you for the compliment, Stephanie. I believe they're opening the ballroom for dinner now." The reception continued in the Grand Meridian's famous crystal ballroom, with its soaring ceilings and panoramic views of the city skyline. I was seated at the family table, though noticeably at the far end, beside distant relatives of Vanessa's rather than near my son. Throughout dinner, I watched as Vanessa held court, accepting compliments on every detail of the wedding with gracious nods to her parents' generosity. Patricia caught my eye once, having the grace to look slightly uncomfortable before turning. Back to her conversation. After the main course, as servers circulated with champagne for the toasts, I excused myself to visit the restroom. In the hallway outside the ballroom, I encountered Vanessa with her bridal party, gathered in a tight circle of satin and tulle, glasses of champagne in hand. "Can't believe she actually showed up looking like that," one bridesmaid was saying, as I approached. "I thought you said she usually dresses like a librarian." "She does," Vanessa replied, her voice carrying clearly in the marble corridor. "Someone must have taken pity and helped her, though honestly, that dress still looks like something from the clearance rack at JCPenney." Laughter rippled through the group before they noticed me standing there. A moment of awkward silence fell, broken by Vanessa's practiced social smile. "Barbara, we were just heading back in for the toasts. That blue is a good color on you, by the way." I stood frozen, the casual cruelty of the moment washing over me. This woman, this girl, who had just married my son, who had accepted my financial contribution without knowledge or gratitude, thought nothing of mocking me to her friends at her own wedding. And in that moment, something broke inside me. Not my spirit, but the chains of politeness and self-sacrifice that had bound me for too long. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said with perfect composure. Though I should mention it's not from JCPenney. It's Carmela Sutera. Diana helped me select it. You know Diana Williams, the stylist who works with the governor's wife? Confusion flickered. Across Vanessa's perfect features, her narrative about her provincial mother-in-law momentarily disrupted. "I didn't realize you knew Diana Williams," she managed. "There's quite a bit you don't realize about me," I replied, my voice steady. "But now isn't the time to discuss it. You're right. They'll be waiting for the toasts." I walked past the group and continued to the bathroom, maintaining my dignity until the door closed behind me. Then I stood before the mirror, watching tears spill onto my cheeks, ruining the careful makeup Diana had applied. And that's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue playing the role everyone expected, the accommodating mother-in-law who accepted disrespect with a smile. Or I could stand up for myself. The check in my evening bag suddenly felt heavy, a physical reminder of not just my financial contribution, but of years spent prioritizing my son's happiness above my own dignity. I dabbed at my mascara, reapplied my lipstick, and took a deep breath. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with clear eyes and newfound resolve. I had raised a son alone, built a career, created a stable life through determination and sacrifice. I had paid for half of this lavish celebration without recognition or thanks. I deserved better than mockery. When I returned to the ballroom, the father of the bride was midway through his toast, raising a crystal flute of champagne that I had paid for, praising the stunning venue that my money had secured. I slipped quietly back to my seat, my decision made. I would wait until after the honeymoon, as agreed with Richard, to have the financial discussion. This was still Christopher's day, and I wouldn't ruin it with a scene. But then Richard concluded his toast with words that changed everything. "Patricia and I couldn't be prouder to welcome Christopher into our family," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "And we're so pleased to have been able to give our daughter the wedding of her dreams, to Vanessa and Christopher." Guests raised their glasses, murmuring approval. Across the table, Patricia caught my eye, a flicker of discomfort crossing her features before she looked away. She knew what her husband had just done, claimed full credit for the wedding, erasing my contribution entirely. Before I could process this betrayal, the wedding planner appeared at my elbow. "Mrs. Collins, it's time for your toast." Panic fluttered in my chest. I had prepared remarks, carefully written notes about love and new beginnings, tucked into my evening. bag alongside the $47,000 check I'd written just yesterday to cover the final payment to the venue. The check that represented months of silent sacrifice, of standing by while being treated as an afterthought in my only child's wedding. I rose slowly, my decision crystallizing with each step toward the microphone. The room fell silent as I took my place, hundreds of eyes turning toward me expectantly. In the center of the head table, Christopher smiled encouragingly, while beside him, Vanessa wore a fixed expression that suggested she was bracing herself for whatever embarrassing, unsophisticated remarks I might offer. For those who don't know me, I'm Barbara Collins, Christopher's mother. I began, my voice steadier than I expected. When my son was 7 years old, he wanted a bicycle for his birthday. Not just any bicycle, but a specific red racing model that had captured his imagination. As a single mother working 2 jobs, that bicycle represented nearly a month's worth of grocery money. I paused, finding Christopher's eyes. He was watching me with a puzzled expression, clearly wondering where this story was going. But I bought it, I continued. I picked up extra shifts, ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, and made it happen. The look on his face when he saw that bicycle taught me something important. That there is no investment more precious than your child's happiness. Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the room. I took a deep breath. Today, watching Christopher marry Vanessa, I've experienced that same joy all over again, which is why I'm so happy that I could contribute to making this day everything they dreamed. I reached into my evening bag and removed the check, holding it up but not yet revealing its amount. In fact, I wanted to take this moment to present my final gift, the remaining balance due to this beautiful venue that has hosted us so wonderfully today. A confused silence fell over the room. Richard straightened in his chair, his expression alarmed. Patricia placed a warning hand on his arm. "Mom," Christopher called, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? Vanessa's parents covered the venue." I smiled, allowing myself a moment to meet Vanessa's suddenly wide eyes. "Actually, Christopher, that's not entirely accurate. While Richard and Patricia generously contributed $30,000 toward your wedding, the total cost was just over $92,000. The remaining $62,000 came from me, including this final payment of $47,000 that's due today." The silence in the ballroom deepened, broken only by a few gasps and murmurs. Christopher stood slowly, his face a mask of confusion and dawning understanding. "Mom, that's not... You couldn't possibly..." "I could, and I did," I said gently. "I've always lived below my means, saved carefully, and invested wisely. When Aunt Margaret left me her inheritance 5 years ago, I put most of it aside. I wanted to have something meaningful to contribute to your future, though I never imagined it would be quite like this." Vanessa had gone very still, her perfect makeup unable to conceal the flush spreading across her cheeks. Next to her, her mother was whispering urgently to Richard, whose face had drained of color. "I don't share this to embarrass anyone," I continued, my voice softening, "but rather to express how much I love you, Christopher, and to welcome Vanessa to our family with complete honesty between us. I believe that's the only foundation on which to build your new life together." I returned to my seat amid a stunned silence that gradually gave way to awkward applause. The wedding planner, sensing disaster, quickly signaled the band to begin playing. As music filled the room and guests cautiously moved toward the dance floor, Christopher made his way to my table, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low and tight with emotion. "Would it have mattered?" I countered gently. "Would you have stood up when Vanessa and her friends mocked my clothes, my home, my life choices? Would you have corrected them when they assumed I couldn't afford to contribute meaningfully to your wedding?" Pain flashed across his features. "I never thought. I didn't realize how much they dismissed me." I finished for him. "Or how much you allowed it." Before he could respond, Vanessa appeared at his side, her face composed into a tight smile for the benefit of watching guests. "Could I speak with you both? Privately?" she asked, her voice strained with controlled anger. We followed her to a small anteroom off the main ballroom, where she rounded on me the moment the door closed. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you humiliate me and my family on my wedding day?" "Vanessa," Christopher began, placing a hand on her arm. She shook him off. "Did you know about this? Did you know your mother was going behind our backs, acting like some sort of financial savior?" "I didn't," he said quietly. "But Mom, why choose this moment to reveal it? Couldn't this have waited until after the wedding?" The disappointment in his voice cut deeper than Vanessa's anger. Even now, he was prioritizing appearances over truth, comfort over honesty. "I had planned to wait," I admitted. "Richard and I had agreed to discuss it with both of you after the honeymoon. But then I overheard Vanessa mocking my dress with her bridesmaids, calling it something from the clearance rack at JCPenney. And then Richard gave a toast taking full credit for the wedding you'd both dreamed of." Christopher turned to his new wife, shock registering on his face. "You said what about my mother?" Vanessa's expression faltered momentarily before she rallied. "It was just girl talk, Christopher. Besides, how was I supposed to know she was secretly wealthy? She lives in that little townhouse, drives a 10-year-old car." "Because I prioritize financial security over showing off," I interrupted quietly. "Because I learned a long time ago that true worth isn't measured in brand names or square footage." "This is ridiculous," Vanessa snapped. "You've ruined our wedding reception to prove some point about values? To get back at me for a few harmless comments?" "No, Vanessa," I said with sudden clarity. "I did it because I've spent the past year being treated as if I'm not good enough to be part of your life with Christopher, as if my contributions, financial or otherwise, couldn't possibly measure up to your standards. I did it because at some point, allowing yourself to be diminished becomes the same as diminishing yourself." Christopher had gone very quiet, looking between his new wife and his mother as if seeing both of us clearly for the first time. "You really said those things about my mom?" he asked Vanessa. "After everything she's done for us?" Something in his tone must have worried her, because Vanessa's approach instantly changed, her eyes filling with calculated tears. "I was stressed about the wedding," she said, touching his arm. "You know how I get when I'm anxious. I didn't mean anything by it." "And the comments about her home, her car, the way you've been treating her since we got engaged?" "Christopher," she said, her voice taking on a warning edge, "we can discuss this later. Right now, we have 200 guests waiting for us to cut the cake." He hesitated, torn between social obligation and the uncomfortable truths being revealed in this small room. "You should rejoin your guests," I said softly. "This is still your wedding day and nothing changes that." "Mom, go," I insisted. "We'll talk tomorrow." After they left, I remained in the anteroom for a few minutes, gathering my composure. I hadn't planned for things to unfold this way, but now that the truth was out, I felt strangely light, as if I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. When I returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Guests were still dancing and drinking, but there was an undercurrent of speculation, of whispered conversations that paused when I walked by. Richard and Patricia had moved to a table in the corner, heads bent in intense discussion. Vanessa was circulating among her friends, her smile brittle but determined. Christopher was nowhere to be seen. I decided it was time to leave. I'd made my point, perhaps not in the way I'd intended, but truthfully nonetheless. I quietly collected my wrap and purse, planning to slip out unnoticed. As I reached the grand foyer, I heard my name. "Mom, wait." Christopher stood by the massive floral arrangement at the entrance. His tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it, a nervous habit from childhood. "You're leaving?" he asked. "I think it's for the best, don't you?" He moved closer, his expression troubled. "I keep replaying conversations in my head, things Vanessa said about you, things I let pass because it seemed easier than confronting her. I convinced myself she just didn't know you well yet, that once you spent more time together." "It's your wedding day," I said gently. "You shouldn't be out here dwelling on uncomfortable realizations." "How much?" he asked suddenly. "How much did you really contribute to today?" "It doesn't matter now." "It matters to me," I sighed. "With the final payment, about $62,000. He looked physically pained. "That's most of what Aunt Margaret left you, isn't it? The money you were going to use to finally visit Europe, to renovate your kitchen." The fact that he remembered those dreams, even as he'd allowed his fiancée to dismiss me and my life, brought fresh tears to my eyes. "I wanted you to have the wedding you wanted," I said simply. "But at what cost, Mom? Not just financial, but—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the awkward scene in the anteroom, the revelations that couldn't be undone. "The truth always comes out eventually," I said. "Better now than years of pretending, of you caught between your wife's disdain and your mother's hurt feelings." A lifetime of emotion passed between us in the silence that followed. Memories of skinned knees and school plays, late-night homework sessions and college move-in day. All the moments that had shaped our relationship as mother and son. "I should have stood up for you," he finally said. "I was so caught up in Vanessa, in her world, in being accepted by her family and friends, that I lost sight of who was really in my corner all along." The simple acknowledgement meant more than any repayment or public apology could have. "You were in love," I said. "We all lose perspective sometimes when we're in love. That's not an excuse." "No," I agreed. "But it is an explanation. And maybe a starting point for doing better." He hugged me then, a real embrace, not the careful, distant contact we'd shared in recent months. For a moment, I felt the echo of the little boy who had once clung to me after his first day of kindergarten, grateful for the familiar comfort of his mother's arms. "What should I do?" he whispered against my hair. I pulled back to look at him, this grown man who was still, in some ways, my child seeking guidance. "Tonight, you go back to your bride and your guests. You celebrate the commitment you've made. And tomorrow, you begin the work of building a marriage based on mutual respect. Not just between you and Vanessa, but for the other people in your lives who matter." Uncertainty clouded his features. "And if that's not possible?" "That's a bridge to cross another day," I said firmly. "This moment isn't about me, or even about Vanessa's behavior. It's about you deciding what kind of man, what kind of husband, and eventually, what kind of father you want to be." He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. "Will you be okay going home alone?" The question touched me with its echo of care, of the relationship we had shared before Vanessa came between us. "I'll be more than okay," I assured him. "I'm going to take a very expensive cab home, pour myself a glass of the good wine I've been saving, and start planning that trip to Europe." A small smile broke through his troubled expression. "The Amalfi Coast first, right? Like you always talked about?" "Exactly." As I watched him walk back into the ballroom, shoulders squared with new resolve, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: regret for the public nature of my revelation, worry for the difficult conversations ahead, for him, but mostly, hope that this moment of honesty might lead to healthier relationships for all of us. Outside, the night air was cool and refreshing after the perfumed warmth of the hotel. As I waited for my cab, I noticed an older woman sitting on a bench nearby, smoking a cigarette with elegant precision. She nodded toward the hotel entrance. "Quite an evening in there, wasn't it?" she asked, her voice husky with age and tobacco. You have no idea, I replied with a small laugh. Oh, I heard, she said, eyes twinkling. I stepped out during that toast of yours. Masterful, if you don't mind my saying so. Rather than feeling embarrassed that my moment had already become wedding gossip, I found myself charmed by her forthright appreciation. I'm Elaine, she continued, extending a hand, grandmother of one of the bridesmaids, the one with the unfortunate spray tan. Barbara, I replied, shaking her hand, mother of the groom. I knew that much, she chuckled. Not. Many women have the courage to speak their truth in rooms full of people determined to keep up appearances. Reminded me of myself 40 years ago. What happened 40 years ago? I asked, intrigued. She gestured for me to join her on the bench. My husband of 22 years announced at our anniversary dinner, which I had cooked and paid for. By the way, that he was leaving me for his secretary. Classic, right? But instead of crying or causing a scene, I stood up, thanked him for his honesty, and then informed the entire restaurant that he'd been systematically embezzling from his company for years. I gasped. Was it true? Completely, she said, with satisfaction. He spent 3 years in minimum security. By the time he got out, I'd rebuilt my life, started my own business, and discovered I was much happier without someone who considered me an accessory to his life rather than a partner in it. Her story made my own revelation seem tame by comparison, but I recognized the same spirit, a refusal to be diminished, to accept disrespect as the price of keeping peace. What happened with your business? I asked. Elaine Harrison Designs, she said with pride. Started as a small interior design firm catering to divorcees like myself, who were reinventing their homes after reinventing their lives. Now my daughter runs the day-to-day, but we have offices in 3 cities. My cab pulled up to the curb, but I found myself reluctant to end this unexpected conversation. Sometimes the hardest part of standing up for yourself is the uncertainty. Afterward, I admitted, I have no idea what happens tomorrow, whether my son's marriage can survive this moment of truth, whether I've done more harm than good. Elaine stubbed out her cigarette with a decisive motion. The truth isn't responsible for the damage it reveals, Barbara. Remember that in the difficult days ahead. I nodded, absorbing her words like a talisman against self-doubt. And for what it's worth, she added, that navy dress was exquisite. Far too good for JCPenney. I laughed genuinely this time, and on impulse, took out one of my business cards. If you're ever looking for family portraits for those offices of yours, give me a call. I've been thinking it's time to expand my photography business beyond the local market. She took the card with a thoughtful expression. You know, we've been talking about updating the website with more personal touches. I might just take you up on that. As the cab drove me home through the quiet streets, I felt a sense of possibility opening before me, not just about potential business connections, but about the life I might create now that I had broken, free from the constraints of always putting others' perceptions and comfort ahead of my own truth. It had taken my son's wedding, and the accumulated slights and dismissals leading up to it, to teach me that self-respect wasn't selfish, it was necessary. That by allowing myself to be diminished, I had enabled patterns that ultimately served no one well, not even my beloved son. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Christopher and Vanessa would return from their honeymoon to a marriage already tested by uncomfortable truths. Richard and Patricia would need to address their daughter's behavior and their own complicity in the facade around the wedding costs. And I would need to navigate a new relationship with all of them, one based on authenticity rather than accommodation. But tonight, as I unlocked the door to my modest townhouse, the home that had sheltered me and Christopher through so many chapters of our lives, I felt strangely at peace. I poured myself that glass of good wine as promised, kicked off my expensive shoes, and opened my laptop. Amalfi Coast Vacation Packages, I typed into the search bar, a smile spreading across my face. The first step in a journey that was, finally, and truly, about me. The sun filtering through my kitchen blinds the next morning felt somehow brighter, as if the world itself was acknowledging my newfound clarity. I sipped my coffee at the small breakfast nook where Christopher and I had shared countless meals throughout his childhood, the events of the previous night settling into perspective with the new day. My phone had been uncharacteristically silent. No texts from Christopher, no calls from Vanessa's parents attempting damage control. The newlyweds would be leaving for their honeymoon in Bali that afternoon, a 2-week escape that now seemed like a fortunate buffer, giving everyone time to process what had happened. I had just finished responding to an email about an upcoming photography assignment when my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I was surprised to find Patricia Winters standing on my porch, looking considerably less polished than she had at the wedding. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup, dressed in what appeared to be workout clothes, a version of her I'd never seen before. "Barbara," she said, her usual confidence notably absent. "I hope I'm not disturbing." "You." I wondered if we might talk. I hesitated only briefly before stepping back to invite her in. "Coffee?" I offered, leading her to the kitchen. "Please," she replied, settling awkwardly at my table, her eyes taking in my home with new awareness. As I poured her a cup, I noticed her gaze lingering on the photographs that lined my walls, professional shots I'd taken over the years, many featuring Christopher at various ages, but also landscapes, architectural studies, and portraits of strangers whose stories had captured my interest. "Did you take all of these?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Most of them," I confirmed, bringing the coffee to the table. Photography was always a passion, even when I could only pursue it between work shifts and parenting responsibilities. She nodded, wrapping her hands around the mug as if seeking warmth despite the mild morning. "Barbara, I owe you an apology. Several, actually." I sat across from her, waiting. After the previous night's revelations, empty platitudes wouldn't suffice, and Patricia seemed to understand that. "Richard and I should have been honest from the beginning about our financial situation," she continued. "And we certainly should have corrected Vanessa's assumptions about your contribution to the wedding." "Why weren't you?" I asked directly. Was it pride? Embarrassment? She sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of long-held appearances. "Both, I suppose. And perhaps a desire to protect Vanessa from disappointment. She's grown up with certain expectations." "Expectations you created," I pointed out. Not unkindly, but factually. "Yes," Patricia admitted, surprising me with her candor. "Richard's family had money once, old Boston wealth that dwindled over generations. When we married, I was determined that our children would have the advantages I never had growing up in a middle-class suburb. We sent them to the right schools, joined the right clubs, cultivated the right connections. But maintaining that lifestyle became increasingly difficult after the recession hit Richard's investments." She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "Instead of adjusting our lifestyle to match our new reality, we kept up appearances, borrowed against the house, leveraged assets, all so Vanessa and her brother could continue believing that financial concerns were something that happened to other people." The irony wasn't lost on me, that while I had been teaching Christopher the value of hard work and careful stewardship, Patricia and Richard had been shielding their children from economic realities that would eventually catch up with them. "And now," I prompted. "Now we're facing some difficult choices," she admitted. "The contribution to the wedding stretched us further than we could afford. Richard has been losing sleep over it for months." Her vulnerability, so at odds with the carefully curated persona she typically presented, moved me unexpectedly. "Why are you telling me this, Patricia?" She met my eyes directly for perhaps the first time in our acquaintance. "Because you deserved better than what you received from our family. Because your generosity, financial and otherwise, was met with condescension and ingratitude. And because I admire the courage it took to stand up for yourself last night. Her words caught me off guard. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger, but not this humble acknowledgement. "What about Vanessa?" I asked. "How is she this morning?" Patricia's expression tightened. Upset, embarrassed, angry. She and Christopher had what I gather was their first serious argument before they left for the airport. My heart sank. Despite everything, I hadn't wanted to create discord between my son and his new wife. I never intended to disrupt their honeymoon. "I know," Patricia said quickly. "And for what it's worth, I think this confrontation was inevitable. Better now than years into a marriage built on uncomfortable dynamics." The echo of my own thoughts from the previous night was startling. "Richard and I have enabled Vanessa's worst tendencies," she continued with painful honesty. "Her sense of entitlement, her dismissiveness toward people she perceives as beneath her socially. Last night was a wake-up call for all of us, I think." We sat in silence for a moment, the morning sunlight creating patterns on my worn kitchen table. In that quiet space, something shifted between us. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition, woman to woman, of the complicated paths we'd traveled. "I have a favor to ask," Patricia said finally. "When Christopher and Vanessa return from their honeymoon, Richard and I would like to host a small family dinner, just the 6 of us. A reset of sorts. Would you consider coming?" The old Barbara would have agreed immediately, prioritizing smooth relations above honest engagement. But I was no longer that woman. "I'll consider it," I said carefully. "But only if we're committed to genuine conversation, not papering over uncomfortable truths for the sake of appearances." Patricia nodded, accepting my condition. "That's fair." She glanced again at the photographs on my wall. "These really are remarkable, you know. Have you ever exhibited your work?" "A small showing at a local gallery last year," I said. "Nothing major." "You should consider expanding," she said thoughtfully. "I serve on the board of the Westside Arts Foundation. They're always looking for fresh perspectives for their community exhibition series." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering professional assistance, Patricia?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Perhaps I am. Consider it a small step toward making amends." After she left, I found myself standing before the wall of photographs, seeing them through fresh eyes. My work had always been a source of private satisfaction, squeezed between more practical pursuits. But what if it could be more? What if the next chapter of my life included pursuing this passion with the same dedication I'd given to raising my son? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. At 58, was I too old to reinvent myself professionally? To step fully into an artistic identity I'd only dabbled in previously? Before I could talk myself out of it, I picked up my phone and called Diana, who had helped transform my exterior for the wedding, and who, I was beginning to realize, might have wisdom to offer about interior transformations as well. "Barbara," she answered on the second ring, "I've been dying to hear what happened after your grand revelation. The suspense is killing me." I laughed, her enthusiasm a balm after the intensity of my conversation with Patricia. "It's been eventful, but actually I'm calling about something else. What would you think about helping me put together a proper portfolio of my photography work?" Diana's squeal of delight was answer enough. By the time we finished our call an hour later, I had the beginnings of a plan. A curated selection of my best work, a website showcasing my portfolio, professional business cards, and a tentative meeting with the director of the very arts foundation Patricia had mentioned. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Between my regular photography assignments, mostly family portraits and small business promotional images that paid the bills, I sorted through years of work, discovering forgotten gems and seeing patterns in my artistic evolution that I'd never noticed before. Diana introduced me to a graphic designer who helped create a stunning website and professional materials. Elaine Harrison, my unexpected ally from the wedding night, made good on her interest in my work, commissioning me to photograph her family for her company's About Us page, leading to connections with several of her wealthy friends who suddenly needed updated portraits. Through it all, I maintained a deliberate silence regarding Christopher and Vanessa. No anxious texts checking if they'd arrived safely in Bali. No fishing for information through mutual acquaintances. I was giving them space to navigate the aftermath of the wedding revelation on their own terms, though the mother in me worried constantly about what impact my actions had had on their new marriage. 17 days after the wedding, as I was preparing to meet with the Arts Foundation director, my doorbell rang for the second unexpected visit of the month. This time, it was my son standing on the porch, looking tanned from his honeymoon, but with shadows under his eyes that suggested not all had been paradise. "Christopher," I said, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "I thought you weren't back until tomorrow." "We came home early," he replied, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Can I come in?" I stepped back, my heart hammering with anxiety. Had my wedding revelation caused irreparable damage to his marriage? Was he here to express anger over my public stand? He moved past me into the living room, hands in his pockets, taking in the changes I'd made in the past 2 weeks. My dining table was covered with photographic prints and portfolio materials. New professional lighting equipment stood in the corner. The space had been transformed from a quiet refuge to a working artist's studio. "You've been busy," he observed, picking up one of my new business cards. "I've been focused," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." He nodded, setting down the card and turning to face me directly. "I owe you an apology, Mom. Several, actually." The echo of Patricia's words from 2 weeks earlier was uncanny. "You don't," I began, but he cut me off with a raised hand. "Please let me say this. I've had a lot of time to think over the past 2 weeks." He took a deep breath. "I let you down. I watched Vanessa and her family treat you with condescension, and instead of standing up for you, I convinced myself it wasn't that bad, that you didn't notice, that it was a small price to pay for keeping the peace." His honesty was both painful and healing, like antiseptic on a wound. "The truth is," he continued, "I was dazzled by Vanessa, by her family, by their lifestyle, and connections. I told myself I was moving up in the world, and part of me, a part I'm not proud of, was embarrassed by our modest background, by the fact that my mother shopped sales and drove old cars and lived carefully. The very choices that allowed me to put you through college without debt," I said quietly, "to help fund your wedding." "Exactly," he acknowledged, shame evident in his expression. I lost sight of what really matters, of who really matters. I gestured toward the sofa, and we both sat, the familiar furniture a contrast to the unfamiliar tenor of our conversation. Never before had we spoken with such raw honesty about our relationship, about the subtle class dynamics that had shaped our lives. "What about Vanessa?" I asked carefully. "How is she processing all this?" Christopher ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture of discomfort from childhood. "That's complicated. The honeymoon was tense. We had several difficult conversations about how she's treated you, about our values and expectations, about the kind of marriage we want to build." I waited, sensing there was more. "We came home early because Vanessa agreed to start marriage counseling," he said finally. "She's struggling, Mom. The financial reality of her family's situation has been a shock. Learning that appearances have been maintained through increasing debt, that the lifestyle she took for granted isn't sustainable, it's shaken her foundation." "And you?" I asked. "Where do you stand in all this?" He considered the question carefully. "I love Vanessa. That hasn't changed. But I've realized that love isn't enough if it's not built on mutual respect and shared values. I'm committed to doing the work to see if we can find common ground, but I'm also prepared for the possibility that we may discover we're fundamentally incompatible. The maturity in his assessment surprised and moved me. This was not the son who had allowed his fiancée to diminish his mother. This was a man taking stock of his choices with clear-eyed honesty. I'm sorry that your relationship is being tested so early, I said sincerely. Don't apologize for telling the truth, Mom, he replied firmly. Whatever happens between Vanessa and me, it needs to be based on reality, not illusions. We talked for nearly 2 hours, covering ground we'd never explored before. His complicated feelings about growing up with less than some of his peers, my own insecurities about being judged for my practical lifestyle choices, the unspoken tensions that had grown between us as he'd become embedded in Vanessa's social circle. I barely recognized you at the wedding, you know, he said at one point. Not just the dress and hair, though those were amazing, but the way you carried yourself when you got up to make that toast, like you'd stepped fully into your own power. That's exactly how it felt, I admitted, like I was finally claiming space I'd always had the right to occupy. He gestured toward my photography materials. And now this. It's like seeing a whole different side of you. Not different, I corrected. Just more complete. I've always been this person, Christopher. I just kept parts of myself small to make room for everyone else's needs and comfort. Understanding dawned in his eyes. And you're not doing that anymore. I'm trying not to, I said with a small smile. Old habits die hard, but I'm working on it. Before he left, Christopher helped me carry my portfolio to the car for my meeting with the Arts Foundation. As he carefully placed the leather case in my trunk, he paused. I wanted to tell you something else, he said, his expression softening. The money for the wedding, I'm going to pay you back. I've already spoken with my financial advisor about setting up a repayment plan. That's not necessary, I protested. It was a gift. A gift given under false pretenses, he countered. I thought Vanessa's parents were covering most costs. I never would have agreed to such an extravagant wedding had I known it was coming. Primarily from you. What does Vanessa say about this plan? I asked, curious about my daughter-in-law's perspective. It was her idea, he said, surprising me completely. She said it was the only way to begin making amends for how her family handled the situation and for how she treated you. The revelation that Vanessa was capable of such self-reflection and accountability gave me unexpected hope for their marriage, whatever challenges lay ahead. After Christopher left, I drove to my meeting with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Whatever happened with the Arts Foundation today, whether they saw value in my work or not, I had already received a priceless gift, the restoration of honesty and mutual respect in my relationship with my son. The Foundation's gallery space was housed in a converted warehouse downtown, its industrial architecture softened by thoughtful design elements and bathed in natural light from massive windows. As I waited in the lobby, portfolio balanced on my lap, I noticed a familiar figure emerging from one of the offices. Barbara, Richard Winters greeted me, surprise evident in his voice. What brings you here? I have a meeting with Elena Diaz, I explained, indicating my portfolio, about a possible exhibition of my photography work. Understanding dawned in his expression. Patricia mentioned she'd suggested the foundation to you. I didn't realize you were pursuing it so quickly. Life is short, I said simply. I'm done postponing my passions. He nodded, a flicker of something like admiration crossing his eye. Features. I owe you an apology for the wedding, he said, lowering his voice slightly. For allowing the misconception about who funded what, for taking credit in my toast that wasn't mine to take. Patricia has already extended the olive branch, I replied, neither accepting nor rejecting his apology outright. She mentioned inviting you to dinner when the kids return, he said. I hope you'll consider coming. There's a lot we need to discuss as a family. The word family caught me off guard. The automatic inclusion of me in that circle despite the tensions of the past 2 years. Christopher came to see me today, I told him. They're back early. Concern flickered across his face. How are they? Working through things, I said diplomatically. Like we all are. Before Richard could respond, a slender woman with a dramatic silver streak in her dark hair approached us. Barbara Collins? She asked, extending her hand. I'm Elena Diaz, the exhibition director. I see you've already met Richard, one of our board members. Richard cleared his throat. Barbara is my daughter-in-law's mother, actually, and a very talented photographer, from what I understand. The simple acknowledgement, free from qualification or condescension, felt like a small victory. Then, I look forward to seeing your work even more, Elena said warmly. Please, come through to the viewing room. As I followed her, Richard called after me. Barbara, I hope we'll see you for dinner next week. Vanessa is planning to cook. The image of my perfectionist daughter-in-law, who had once dismissed my homemade birthday cake for Christopher as quaint, attempting to prepare a family meal, brought an unexpected smile to my face. I'll be there, I called back, stepping into the next chapter of my story, one where my voice was clear, my boundaries firm, and my talents recognized, not just by others but most importantly, by myself. Elena led me into a bright room with white walls and simple wooden tables. So, she said as I began to unpack my portfolio, tell me about your artistic vision, Barbara. What story are you trying to tell with your work? I extracted a series of black and white photographs. Ordinary people caught in moments of quiet dignity. A grocery store cashier with careworn hands counting change. An elderly man feeding pigeons in the park. A young mother studying at a library with her child asleep beside her. I capture the beauty in everyday resilience, I said with newfound confidence. The moments when people stand in their truth, whether anyone is noticing or not. Elena picked up one of the prints, studying it with expert eyes. Yes, she said after a moment. Yes, I can certainly see that. Let's talk about how we might showcase this perspective in our community voices. Exhibition next month. As we began discussing formats and themes, I felt a profound sense of alignment, as if all the parts of myself were finally working in harmony rather than competition. The mother who had sacrificed for her son, the artist who had kept her passion alive through lean years, the woman who had finally learned to stand in her own light, even when others tried to dim it. The journey that had begun with humiliation at my son's wedding had led me here, not to a place of anger or retribution, but to a life more authentically lived, to relationships based on truth rather than accommodation, to opportunities I might never have pursued had I not finally said, enough. Sometimes, I reflected as Elena enthusiastically sketched a potential layout for my exhibition, the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to be seen, not as others wish us to be, but as we truly are, in all our complex, imperfect glory. 6 months after my son's wedding, I stood in the center of the Westside Arts Foundation Gallery, surrounded by my photographs displayed on pristine white walls. The exhibition opening was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and Elena had given me a moment alone with my work before the public arrived. Each image represented a piece of my journey, not just as a photographer, but as a woman who had finally learned to value her own voice. Look at what you've created, I whispered to myself, turning slowly to take in the culmination of decades of passion often relegated to the margins of my life. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a triptych titled Revelation, 3 large-format photographs capturing women at moments of personal truth. The first showed an elderly woman laughing uproariously, head thrown back, completely unconcerned with how she might appear to others. The second featured a young corporate executive removing high heels under her desk, the relief on her face palpable as she massaged her foot, believing herself unobserved. The third, most powerful image was of a bride, veil lifted, tears streaming down her face, Not the pretty tears of wedding photographs, but the raw emotion of someone confronting the magnitude of a life-changing decision. These weren't wedding photographs or standard portraits. They were moments of authentic humanity I'd been collecting for years, often between paid assignments, following my own artistic instincts rather than client specifications. "This is extraordinary work, Barbara." I turned to find Elena in the doorway, clipboard in hand, surveying the space with professional satisfaction. "We've had tremendous response to the pre-opening publicity," she continued. "The feature in the Arts Weekly really struck a chord." Second acts, Barbara Collins captures life's turning points. People are intrigued by both your work and your story. I smiled, still adjusting to being the subject of attention rather than the observer behind the camera. The interviewer from Arts Weekly had been particularly interested in how I'd come to my first major exhibition at age 58, after decades of treating photography as a side pursuit while raising a son alone. I'd been honest about my journey, including the wedding incident that had catalyzed my transformation, though I'd kept personal details vague out of respect for Christopher and Vanessa. "The guest list tonight includes several gallery owners from downtown," Elena added, consulting her clipboard. "And the director of the State Photography Museum mentioned he might stop by. Your work is creating quite a buzz in the community." Before I could respond, Diana burst through the doors, elegant as always in a sculptural black dress, carrying a garment bag over her arm. "Sorry I'm late," she exclaimed, air-kissing Elena before turning to me with critical assessment. "You haven't changed yet. Barbara, guests will arrive in 25 minutes. I gestured to my perfectly acceptable pantsuit. "I am changed. This is what I plan to wear." Diana exchanged a look with Elena that needed no translation. "No, no, no. This is your night. Your emergence as an artist. Your pantsuit is lovely for a day at the office. But this," she unzipped the garment bag with theatrical flair, "this is what an artist wears to her first exhibition opening." Inside was a stunning ensemble in deep emerald green, flowing palazzo pants and a coordinating silk tunic with subtle embroidery at the neckline. Sophisticated, yet comfortable, dramatic without being ostentatious, it was exactly what I would have chosen for myself if I'd had Diana's unerring eye for fashion. "It's beautiful," I admitted, touching the fabric reverently. "And it will look even more beautiful on you," Diana insisted. "Now hurry and change. I've brought accessories too." 20 minutes later, transformed by Diana's expert styling, I hardly recognized my reflection. The emerald green made my gray-streaked hair look deliberately chic rather than simply aging, and the cut of the tunic emphasized my best features while skimming over others with elegant discretion. "Now you look like your photographs," Diana declared with satisfaction. Authentic, dignified, with unexpected depth. The first guests began arriving precisely at 7. A steady stream that quickly filled the gallery with conversation and appreciation. Art patrons, local photographers, foundation donors, and curious community members moved through the space, pausing before images, reading the accompanying text I'd written about each piece, occasionally glancing my way with newfound respect. I circulated as Elena had coached me to do, answering questions about my process, accepting compliments with growing confidence, explaining my artistic choices without diminishing their significance. It was a new role for me, claiming expertise, owning my talent, but one I was surprised to find I inhabited naturally. "The emotional intelligence in these photographs is remarkable," commented an elegant woman who introduced herself as the curator of a prestigious downtown gallery. "You capture people at moments of private truth, yet there's nothing voyeuristic about it. How do you establish that trust with your subjects?" "I believe people sense when they're truly seen," I replied, the answer coming naturally after months of reflection on my work. Not judged, not categorized, but genuinely witnessed. When I look through my lens, I'm not searching for perfection or even conventional beauty. I'm looking for authenticity. those fleeting moments when pretense falls away and true self emerges. She nodded thoughtfully. That philosophy comes through clearly. I'd be interested in discussing a showing at our space in the spring. Perhaps something expanding on this theme of revelation and authenticity. As she handed me her card, I caught sight of familiar figures entering the gallery. Christopher and Vanessa had arrived, along with Richard and Patricia. My son immediately spotted me across the room, his face lighting up with unmistakable pride as he navigated through the crowd, Vanessa following with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "Mom," Christopher said, embracing me warmly. "This is incredible. I knew you were talented, but seeing your work like this..." He gestured to the surrounding photographs. "It's extraordinary." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely moved by his enthusiasm. "I'm so glad you could make it." I turned to Vanessa, who was studying one of my photographs with careful attention. The 6 months since the wedding had changed her, subtly in appearance, more profoundly in demeanor. The polished perfection remained, but the hauteur had diminished, replaced by something more thoughtful, more considered. "Your work is remarkable, Barbara," she said, meeting my eyes directly. "You capture such vulnerability in your subjects." The acknowledgement, offered without qualification or condescension, represented significant growth from the woman who had once dismissed my entire existence as provincial. "Thank you, Vanessa," I replied simply. "How are your classes going?" Following the wedding revelations about her family's financial situation, Vanessa had made some surprising choices. She'd enrolled in business courses at the local university, determined to understand finance in a way her privileged upbringing had never required. It was, Christopher had explained during one of our newly transparent conversations, her way of taking control of her future rather than maintaining the illusion of effortless affluence. "Challenging," she admitted with unexpected candor, "but illuminating. I never realized how much I didn't know about practical financial management." Before our conversation could continue, Elena appeared at my elbow, gently reminding me that it was time for the formal remarks. I excused myself and made my way to the small podium set up near the exhibition's central triptych. As the room quieted, I looked out at the gathered faces, friends who had supported me through decades of single motherhood, new acquaintances from the art world, my son and his wife, the Winters who had evolved from antagonists to something approaching family, and many strangers drawn by interest in my work. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady with newfound confidence. Art, at its core, is about seeing and being seen. For most of my life, I've been the observer, the one behind the camera, capturing others' stories while keeping my own carefully contained. I gestured to the photographs surrounding us. These images represent moments of truth, instances when people reveal themselves, intentionally or otherwise. What fascinates me is the beauty in that vulnerability, the strength it takes to stand authentically in one's own life. My eyes found Christopher's in the crowd, his expression thoughtful as he listened. 6 months ago, I experienced my own moment of revelation, I continued. After decades of placing others' comfort above my own truth, of making myself smaller to accommodate expectations, I finally stood firmly in my own worth. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was necessary. A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience, each person connecting the words to their own experiences of self-diminishment and the yearning for authentic expression. That moment changed everything, not because I suddenly became someone new, but because I finally embraced who I had been all along. The artist whose work surrounds you tonight wasn't born 6 months ago. She has always existed, watching, waiting, developing her eye and her heart through years of quiet observation. I paused, gathering my thoughts for the most important part of my message. If there's wisdom I've gained from this journey, it's this. It's never too late to reclaim the parts of yourself you've set aside. Never too late to insist on being fully seen. Never too late to stand in the light of your own creation and say, "This is me, all of me." Not just the convenient parts, not just the accommodating facade, but the full, complex, imperfect truth of who I am. The room had fallen completely silent, faces turned toward me with rapt attention. Look around at these photographs. Each subject is caught in a moment of personal truth, joyful or painful, planned or unexpected. My hope is that they inspire you to recognize and honor those moments in your own lives. Because it's in those instances of authentic presence that we find not just our true selves, but our connection to each other's humanity. As I stepped away from the podium to warm applause, I felt a profound sense of alignment, as if the various fragments of my life had finally fused into a coherent whole. The mother, the artist, the woman standing in her own power, all aspects of the same integrated self. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversations, congratulations, and connections. 3 of my pieces sold within the first hour, small red dots appearing beside them to mark them as claimed. A local arts magazine asked to schedule an in-depth interview. The curator who had spoken with me earlier introduced me to colleagues with discussions of future collaborations. Through it all, I remained grounded in the surreal realization that this was actually happening, that my work was being valued, that my voice was being heard, that the leap of faith I'd taken 6 months ago had led to this moment of professional affirmation. As the crowd began to thin near the end of the evening, I found myself standing before my favorite photograph in the exhibition, a simple image of an elderly woman sitting on a park bench, feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons. There was nothing overtly remarkable about the scene, and yet I'd captured something in her expression, a serene self-possession, a woman completely at peace with her place in the world. "That's the one I connect with most," said a voice beside me. I turned to find Vanessa studying the photograph with genuine interest. There's something about her quiet confidence that feels aspirational. The sincere engagement, free from the performative politeness that had characterized our early interactions, caught me by surprise. "I took that 3 years ago," I explained. "She was at the park every Tuesday at the same time. When I finally asked her story, she told me she'd been a high-powered attorney who'd given up a partnership track to care for her ailing husband. After he passed, instead of returning to law, she discovered she preferred a simpler life with time for contemplation." "No regrets?" Vanessa asked, still studying the woman's peaceful expression. "She said something I've never forgotten," I replied. "Regret looks backward, wisdom looks around." She meant that true wisdom isn't about lamenting past choices, but about being fully present to the life you have now, with all its complexity and possibility. Vanessa nodded slowly, absorbing the words. After a moment of silence, she turned to face me directly. "I owe you an apology, Barbara," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Not just for how I behaved at the wedding, but for the 2 years preceding it. I was condescending, dismissive, and cruel, really. There's no excuse for it." The directness of her acknowledgement, offered without defensiveness or qualification, represented significant growth from the entitled young woman who had once mocked my dress to her bridesmaids. "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious about her evolution. She gestured vaguely around the gallery. "Everything. Finding out my family wasn't as financially secure as I'd been raised to believe. Learning that you, whom I'd dismissed as unsophisticated, had been the one to make my dream wedding possible. Watching Christopher struggle with his disappointment in both me and himself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The hardest part was recognizing that I had built my entire identity around external markers of status and success. When those were revealed as partly illusion, I had to confront who I was beneath the designer clothes and social connections." Her candor moved me unexpectedly. "That's difficult work," I acknowledged. Many people never attempt it. We almost didn't make it, she admitted, lowering her voice further. The first few weeks after the honeymoon were challenging. The counseling helped, but ultimately it came down to whether we could build something new together, something based on mutual respect rather than shared illusions. I thought of the dinners over the past 6 months. Initially awkward gatherings where we'd all navigated new dynamics, gradually evolving into genuine family meals with moments of surprising connection. I'd watched Vanessa struggle to reconcile her upbringing with her new reality, observed her attempts to contribute more authentically to conversations, noted her growing interest in understanding perspectives beyond her privileged bubble. "You're doing the work," I said simply. "Both of you, that's what matters." "Your exhibition has made me think about authenticity in a new way," she continued, gesturing toward the surrounding photographs. "These moments you've captured, they're not necessarily the polished, perfect versions people want to present to the world. They're real, sometimes messy, but somehow more beautiful for their truth." "That's exactly what I try to convey," I said, surprised and touched by her insight. "I spent most of my life curating how others perceived me," Vanessa said thoughtfully. "The right clothes, the right connections, the right opinions. I'm only now learning the freedom in being genuinely myself, even when that self is uncertain or imperfect." Our conversation was interrupted by Christopher approaching with champagne flutes. "They're getting ready to close up." But Elena said, "We could stay for a private toast," he explained, handing us each a glass, "to the artist of the hour." As Richard and Patricia joined us, along with Diana and Elena, I was struck by the improbable gathering, this makeshift family created through conflict, reconciliation, and the gradual building of mutual respect. 6 months ago, I could never have imagined standing in my own gallery exhibition, surrounded by these particular people, all of us changed by the aftermath of a wedding revelation. "I'd like to propose a toast," Richard said, raising his glass, "to Barbara, whose courage in speaking her truth forced all of us to examine our own. Your talent is extraordinary, but your integrity is what truly inspires." "To Barbara," the others echoed, glasses raised. As we sipped champagne in the quiet gallery, surrounded by my photographs, tangible evidence of my artistic vision finally given proper space, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with internal alignment. Later that night, after the exhibition closed and the guests departed, I returned to my townhouse, the home I had once feared Vanessa judged as inadequate. In the month since the wedding, I'd made small but meaningful changes to the space, not to impress others but to better reflect my evolving sense of self. The dining area had been transformed into a proper photography studio with professional lighting and backdrops. The spare bedroom now served as an office where I managed the business aspects of my growing artistic career. I kicked off my shoes and made myself a cup of tea, settling into my favorite reading chair with the guest book from the exhibition. Flipping through the pages, I read comments from strangers moved by my work, from old friends expressing pride in my emergence as an artist, from new connections in the art world expressing interest in future collaborations. On the final page was a note from Christopher. "Mom, I always saw pieces of who you were. Tonight I finally saw you whole. Thank you for teaching me through your example that it's never too late to become fully yourself. Your courage changes everyone around. I love you, C." His words brought tears to my eyes. Not the wounded tears of that bathroom at the wedding, but tears of recognition, of being truly seen by the person whose opinion had always mattered most to me. As I sipped my tea in the quiet of my home, I reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The wedding revelation that had seemed so catastrophic in the moment had actually been the catalyst for profound transformation, not just for me, but for everyone involved. Vanessa was developing self-awareness and humility. Richard and Patricia were confronting the consequences of prioritizing appearances over financial reality. and Christopher was growing into a man who valued authenticity over accommodation, truth over comfortable illusions. My phone chimed with a text message from Elena. Final count. 7 pieces sold tonight. The museum director wants to meet next week about acquiring your Revelation triptych for their permanent collection. This is just the beginning, Barbara. I set down the phone, allowing the significance of those words to wash over me. Just the beginning. At 58 years old, I was experiencing not the diminishment that society often expected of women my age, but an expansion of creative expression, of professional opportunity, of personal authenticity. The journey had not been easy. Standing up at that wedding reception had required courage I wasn't sure I possessed until the moment I acted. The conversations that followed, with Christopher, with Vanessa, with the Winters, had demanded vulnerability, honesty, and the willingness to forge new relational patterns rather than falling back into comfortable but dysfunctional dynamics. But the reward had been beyond anything I could have imagined. Not just the exhibition success, though that validation was profoundly meaningful, but the deeper satisfaction of finally living as my complete self. No more compartmentalizing my artistic passion as a hobby. No more swallowing hurt to keep peace. No more accepting dismissal as the price of inclusion in my son's life. I walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street bathed in moonlight. The memory of sitting in my car outside the wedding venue, mascara streaking down my face as I clutched that check for $47,000, seemed simultaneously recent and from another lifetime. That moment of humiliation had contained the seeds of my liberation, though I couldn't have recognized it then. The truth was, I wouldn't change any of it. Not Vanessa's mockery of my dress, not the revelation about who had paid for the wedding, not the uncomfortable conversations that followed. Each step, however painful in the moment, had been necessary to break patterns established over decades and create space for something new to emerge. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, still wearing the emerald green ensemble Diana had brought for the exhibition, my silver-streaked hair arranged in an elegant updo, my posture straight with newfound confidence. But it was my eyes that captured my attention, clear, direct, at peace with the woman looking back at me. "This is what standing in your truth looks like," I whispered to my reflection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There were interviews to give, connections to follow up on, a potential book project Elena had mentioned featuring my photography alongside my reflections on midlife transformation. My calendar for the coming months was filling with commitments that would have seemed impossibly beyond reach just 6 months earlier. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of my first exhibition, I allowed myself to simply appreciate the journey, not just its destination, but every difficult step that had led me here. The confrontation at the wedding, the painful conversations with Christopher, the gradual rebuilding of relationships on foundations of truth rather than accommodation. As I drifted toward sleep, a thought crystallized with perfect clarity. The most powerful act of love, for others and for ourselves, is not sacrifice or accommodation, but authenticity. By finally insisting on being fully seen, I had not only transformed my own life, but created space for everyone around me to engage with reality rather than comfortable illusions. That night, I dreamed not of past hurts or future anxieties, but of the woman feeding pigeons in the park, serene, self-possessed, completely at peace with her place in the world. In the dream, she looked up at me and smiled, as if acknowledging a fellow traveler who had finally found her way to the same quiet confidence, the same unshakable knowledge of her own worth. In the morning, I would wake to the first day of my new life, not as Barbara Collins, mother and widow who took photographs on the side, but as Barbara Collins, artist and truth-teller, claiming the full measure of her talents and her voice. The journey had been unexpected, sometimes painful, but ultimately more rewarding than I could have imagined. As it turns out, sometimes the most beautiful revelations begin with the courage to say, "This is who I am, all of me, and that is enough." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.